Well, so thank you. This is my inaugural podcast. So the name of it is Journey into the Mystic, and the theme of it really is on mystical states and mystical states across domain, but ultimately how they all connect us and how healing happens there. And so I am particularly excited to talk to you. And then I'm just going to read your bio very quickly. And then I have a list of questions for you.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, so Dr. Andrew Newberg is the Director of Research at the Marcus Institute of Integral Health and a physician at Jefferson University Hospital. Board certified in internal and nuclear medicine. His research focuses on the relationship between brain function and various mental states, particularly religious and mystical experiences, and has included brain scans during prayer, meditation, as well as studies on aging, dementia, and other neurological disorders. Dr. Andrew Newberg conducted a groundbreaking study of the impact of orgasmic meditation on the brain using PET fMRI technology. He has published over 250 peer-reviewed articles and 14 books, presented his work globally, and appeared on numerous media platforms, earning recognition as one of the most influential neuroscientists alive today, which is very exciting. And I am Rachel Pelletier. I am an 18-year erotic practitioner, orgasmic meditation specifically, and an addiction counselor. And Dr. Andy and I are going to have a discussion today on the mystical states. So we will dive right in. So I wanted to start with this line that you put in your book, which is phenomenal, by the way. And your work in general is mind-blowing, but this book in particular was pretty mind-blowing in terms of the intersection between sexuality and the human experience, sexuality and mystical experience. And so you say this line that says, exploring the relationship between sexuality and spirituality may offer an answer to how religion got into the brain, regardless of your personal beliefs. Thus, we will consider both spiritual and evolutionary answers. And I was wondering if you could say more on that.
Sure. Well, a lot of this research goes back many years. I've been fortunate to be able to be exploring what's going on in the brain when people are engaged in different spiritual practices and have very intense spiritual or mystical experiences. And I think one of the important points that often comes up, and I do address this a lot in my work, is, what does this mean in the grand picture of things in terms of the nature of reality and what the actual meaning of these experiences are. And with that in mind, part of the thing is that while we can do a brain scan of orgasmic meditation or other types of mystical, experiences, if we see a change that's going on in the brain, what does that ultimately mean? Does it mean that the experience, the spiritual, the religious experience is just a manifestation of the brain's functions? Does it mean that the brain is somehow enabling us to have these experiences that are true spiritual or religious experiences? Is the brain, a kind of receiver of spirituality or, God's will or whatever the particular person's perspective is? And I think, to me, this whole field, which is sometimes referred to as neurotheology, really needs to be very balanced in terms of how it thinks about what the implications of this research are, because ultimately the answer is a little bit of yes to all of that.
Right.
So that's really what that quote means, which is that if you are an ardent believer in religion, or the spiritual realm, then I think personally, you'd have to look at. It makes sense that if God was up in heaven and we're down here, that we would have a brain and an ability to perceive God, connect with God, pray to God, and do all those kinds of things. If there's a universal consciousness, our brain should be able to connect to that universal consciousness in some way. So if you're an ardent believer, then the fact that this has signatures in the brain would make sense. And of course, if you feel like this really, the material world is it, and all of these experiences are just part of the unbelievable workings of the human brain. Well, that conclusion is not unreasonable either, and in many ways is supported by the research that we're doing. So I think the important point for people to realize is that irrespective of what your overall beliefs are, this information can be very helpful for people to understand what's going on within us when we have those experiences, and specifically what's going on within our biology when we have those experiences. It doesn't diminish the experiences. It doesn't take away the potential for some true, mystical or spiritual aspect of these experiences. But it helps us to understand how we as human beings are able to have those experiences.
Yeah, thanks. I love that. I don't know if you can answer this or this, but I was wondering, have you had people that participated in the studies that, let's say, maybe didn't believe in God or ritual or whatever, or even maybe they have or haven't had a mystical experiences, and were their ideas about it changed after? And I ask because, I just finished this 9-month training program in psychedelic assisted therapy and research. And a lot of the research they presented was on the psilocybin studies that, Dr. Roland Griffiths did, and Bill Richards came and they spoke, and they were saying that, people that, especially for end of life, would come in and maybe they didn't believe in anything, and they were terrified of dying, and they would go through the experience of being on psilocybin, and they would come out the other side with this really, not only a deep sense of peace, which if that was it, that would likely have been enough for them, but they came out on the other side citing these mystical experiences. And so I was curious if you had seen any crossover in that way or had experiences like that in your research.
Well, the one of the books that we published recently was called The Varieties of Spiritual Experience, and it was based off of a survey that we ran, an online survey of people's most intense spiritual experiences. And we have about 2,000 experiences that are described to us, and the people tell us about themselves and their psychological state and whether they were under the influences of a psychedelic and or not, and all different traditions and so forth. And so while it's very challenging to sort of do a brain scan to capture that moment, and in that regard, I don't know if we've technically done that. Certainly there are a lot of people who talk about these experiences and how they the transformative element of them. And that is in many ways one of the key characteristics that people describe when it comes to these experiences. So it does change them. It gives them a sense of clarity and a sense of new understanding about the world. And it's interesting. I mean, sometimes it can take someone who is an atheist and make them a believer. Sometimes it can take somebody who is of one spiritual tradition, and then they become, maybe they were born Catholic and now they've become Buddhist or something like that, or vice versa.
Yeah.
And that to me is really one of the big, I mean, it's a great question that you pose, because I think it's a fundamentally important question in terms of this whole field of neurotheology and how these experiences affect us. And it is interesting. I mean, I have interviewed some people who had near-death experiences, and for them, it was their brain dying, but they still describe the tunnel and the white light and this, these incredible mystical sounding experiences. But for them, because of their prevailing belief system, that there is no spiritual realm, they kind of couched all of that in this is the way my brain dies. And then for other people, it is a way of kind of opening a person up to the spiritual realm. And again, I mean, on one hand, I think we can look at what's going on in the brain and help us to try to understand the nature of those experiences. But it does get at what to me is a more fundamental question, which has really been the question that kind of drives all of my work, which is how do we as human beings experience and understand reality, and how can we know that reality? And it is, the point that you're also making, which I think is also very important, is that one of the characteristics of these intense spiritual experiences is that, not only do they carry with them a very profound sense of of kind of transformation and understanding of the world, but they carry with them a very profound sense of realness, that not
Mm,
only, is the experience real, but it is, quote unquote, more real than our
right.
everyday reality experience. And so, it kind of, it gets to the, this age-old question about, how much data or information or whatever does one need in order to be transformed.
Mm,
I had a really good friend who was a very profound atheist, did not believe in God whatsoever. And he used to say to me, well, if God exists, then, why does God just come down, shake my hand and say, here I am? And I said, but if God did that to you, you would check yourself into a mental institution. You would
right.
think that you were having a psychotic episode.
Right.
And,
Right.
it's like the, whatever the, those movies like Oh God and Bruce Almighty,
Yeah.
like at what level of convincing does it take for somebody to realize that there is a different way of looking at the world? And these are fundamental questions for us. And to me, this is real strength of the field of neurotheology, which is to try to understand these experiences and how they take people in different directions.
Mm,
And even, in Sex, God, and the Brain, one of we might get into this a little bit more, but one of the big questions that I do address in there is about sort of the positive versus the negative side of things. And some people turn towards religion and as a deeply religious person become compassionate and loving and charitable and altruistic and do everything they can to help all of humanity. Other people, are willing to strap a bomb around their chest and,
yeah.
and blow up people who don't agree with them. So, but they're both religious. And so what is it about one perspective of religion that takes you in one direction and the other takes you in a different direction? And we
Yeah.
don't know the answer to those questions, but to me, that's
Right.
where neurotheology may help us to understand those differences.
Yeah, I loved what you said about the nature of reality and asking these questions. And it's funny, I have so many follow-up questions just from that one line. But one of them, well, I have two actually. One is, what have you seen in the brain? Because I know you've done a lot of modalities. I think you've done whirling dervish and meditation and prayer and orgasmic meditation. And so I'm curious in terms of those modalities where people enter a mystical state, is there something consistent you've seen in the brain in terms of mystical state access? And then I would say, coupled with that, have you seen changes in people's health, like physical health, emotional health, spiritual health, let's say relational health?
Yeah, so I mean, those are two different. They're two really good and important
Yeah.
questions. So let me take the second one first,
Okay.
which is that so a lot of these practices do affect people's health, and the sort of the classic examples are that when people engage in meditation practices or when they have a deep spiritual experience, because it comes with a profound sense of realness, a profound sense of understanding the world. There tends to be a reduction of anxiety, a
Mm.
reduction of depression. We used to call it ontological anxiety, and
Oh, interesting.
that kind of improves, that we now kind of understand the world and we understand the way the world is, so that piece of our anxiety seems to be a little bit better.
Mm,
In our survey, one of the questions, or a series of questions that we asked in there, was how did your life change as the result of having this experience? And then we asked about relationships, about their job, about their fear of death, their sense of spirituality, their sense of religiousness. And then we said, did it get a lot better, a little better, not much change, a little bit worse, or a lot worse? And I would say that, if you kind of looked at the numbers, about 85 to 90% of people said that these experiences made improve their lives.
mm.
Maybe not in every domain, but certainly in terms of their kind of, their quality of life, the way they thought about their world, their psychological health, their physical and mental health, certainly their spiritual perspective on things. So a lot of people do talk about there being a positive impact. And however, going back to the point I made just a moment ago, there are 3 to 5% of people who say it went bad, that it didn't go well. And you mentioned your work looking at psilocybin and other psychedelics in terms of helping people, but people do have bad trips, and people,
Right.
it's not all rosy, and so sometimes things can get very bad for people, and sometimes in terms of the when it comes to these different experiences, even a positive experience sometimes can be challenging for people to know how to
Mm,
incorporate it into their beliefs. And then there can be that struggle of sort of bringing it in. So again, to me, where neurotheology kind of comes about, which is, how can we help to understand the good and the bad, and, what is the impact for that? But certainly there seems to, overall, there seems to be a positive impact for that. So now to your first question about, are there certain common elements of these experiences? So again, part of how I try to get at this from the brain perspective is in some senses through the surveys that we got, because that tells us not just about the brain, but what the person is experiencing. And that to me is very important, because spiritual experiences do have a uniqueness to them. Everybody has a slightly different experience than the person next to them. And so, every experience has its own kind of unique features to it. But when we ran these descriptions through a content analysis to understand what's going on while the people, are there certain common elements, common themes to them? There do seem to be certain things, and we do seem to see this across the board, irrespective of the tradition, irrespective of the practice. Now, exactly how much, and I mean, everything, there's a lot of subtlety to all of this, so it's very
right.
difficult to say everyone is exactly the same. They're not. But some of the most common elements of all of these experiences are, well, as we talked about, a sense of clarity, a sense of
Mm,
understanding is one of them, a sense of intensity, that the experience itself is the most intense experience that they've ever had. And that may not be the entire, I mean, it could be the entire experience, but it could be elements of that experience too. It may be, when we studied orgasmic meditation, and people talk about, this incredible like rush of energy, as like more
mm,
intense feeling of energy than they get from, any other kind of practice or experience or something like that. It could be a feeling of love. It could be, a feeling of awe. Whatever it is, it's sort of the most of something that they've ever had. So clarity, intensity, and then a third element is a sense of unity, a sense of oneness, a sense of connectedness. And this does tend to be a very universal characteristic. And this also ties back into the Sex, God, and the Brain book, because when we talk about kind of even an evolutionary basis for where these experiences come from, we're talking about sexuality, we're talking about mating, the mating rituals that occur in animals, which create a unity, create, a oneness of the two animals to come together to mate, which is, you don't mate otherwise. And so that ability to have that sense of connectedness with something else, another animal, in the case of most animal rituals, can be expanded in the human mind and in human rituals to a group of people, a congregation. It can be, all of humanity. It could be God. It could be the entire universe. So it could be a variety of different things that a person feels connected to. But that profound sense of oneness, unity, again, different words that people use, but that is a third key element. And then the fourth element, and so this is not in any particular ordering, a fourth element of these experiences is a sense of surrender,
mm,
a sense of kind of letting go. And what we mean by that is that usually in these cases, in these experiences, it feels to the person as if it's happening to them
mm,
instead of them making it happen.
mm.
And so, that seems to be a characteristic element of these experiences. And then the last element is what we just talked about, this transformative change that occurs. But given these five core elements, we can start to extrapolate what's going on in the brain itself.
Mm.
So when we talk about unity, as an example, an area of the brain that I typically talk about is the parietal lobe, which is located in the
I was
back
going to
part of the
ask
brain.
you about it, so I'm glad
Yep,
you brought it up.
exactly. And so, the parietal lobe helps us to create our spatial representation of
Mhm.
ourselves, takes our sensory information to do that. And in a lot of these practices, and whether it is Christian prayer, whether it is orgasmic meditation, whether it is a Buddhist meditation, if you have that experience of oneness and connectedness, then what we see in the brain is a decrease of activity in the parietal lobe, which I think makes sense, that when when the parietal lobe turns on, it helps you to kind of create this very clear sense of who you are. And when this area starts to shut down, then you begin to lose that boundary between yourself and other. And again, that other can be a single individual, as in the case of mating or sexuality. It can be a group, it can be the universe or whatever. So we tend to see those kinds of changes occurring in a lot of the practices that we do. Now, again, not every spiritual practice talks about this sense of unity, but certainly the more powerful experiences tend to describe that. And I think we tend to see that even in the psychedelic experiences that you were mentioning before. And then just to pick up on one other area of the brain first is that sense of surrender. That seems to have something to do with the frontal lobes, that when you engage in a practice initially, like we're doing a prayer practice, your frontal lobes typically turn on first because you're concentrating on the practice, you're focusing on the prayer, on your breath, whatever it is that you're focusing on. But that as time goes on, you begin to, if you get to a state where you have a decrease of activity in that frontal lobe, then suddenly your purposefulness, your willfulness seems to go away, and it feels like it's kind of happening to you, it's coming to you. And so, we tend to see those kinds of experiences, flow experiences and so forth, that are associated with that decrease of activity. But ultimately, and maybe this is the final answer to your question, I think there's an entire network of structures in the brain that become involved in these spiritual experiences. How you engage that network can be different depending on what you're doing. And if you're doing what arguably is a kind of top-down experience, then maybe you're concentrating, so you're using your frontal lobes, and then eventually it kind of changes your emotional centers, ultimately your autonomic nervous system, which regulates your body's arousal and calming center, systems of the body. So it kind of starts up in the brain and kind of works its way down. Different rituals and certainly sexual stimulation is what we see in like orgasmic meditation, are probably a little bit more of a bottom up, or at least some combination of the two. Because like with orgasmic meditation, the interesting element there is that there is a lot of sort of cognitive things that are going on as part of the interaction that you have between the two individuals engaged in the practice. But there's also the bottom up aspect of the sexual stimulation that provides the quote the energy for the practice. And so when we do the brain scans, and we can talk a little bit more about that, but we see a kind of more true hybrid of both what's coming from the bodily experiences up into the higher parts of the brain, as well as what's going on in the brain itself. But again, there are all different ways in which this whole network of structure seems to be activated or involved, and it depends on the practice, it depends on the tradition, and it depends on the outcome of the experiences.
Thank you. I wanted to stay on orgasmic meditation for a moment. And I have a couple of questions related to it, but I wanted to make this comment. I like how you said orgasmic meditation was this hybrid effect of below and above, because how we talk about it in terms of an ethos perspective is, as above, so below, but the below being the body, and actually the body having this innate wisdom. And so, I love, it's like you're one of the top neuroscientists is saying, this idea of above and below. And so I was wondering, in terms of orgasmic meditation, what did you see? So I have a few questions. What did you see in terms of mystical experiences in the brain with oming specifically? And then when you say it's a hybrid, I was wondering if you could talk more about what that means and what you saw specifically. And I know you had talked about in a previous interview, I think it was the cognitive function in the stroker, in terms of what was occurring there from that position.
So I think that, first of all, the part of what we're talking about here is the autonomic nervous system, which basically is part of what kind of connects the body to the brain. And so when we talk about different rituals, there are fast rituals, there are slow rituals, and those rituals involve different sensory, stimuli, which can be visual, it can be tactile, so there are a lot of different ways of doing that. And I think that when we talk about something like orgasmic meditation, the idea here is that you are utilizing a sensory stimulus, which ultimately has sexual elements to it, that is going to be very prominent in terms of driving the autonomic nervous system. So when we actually measured things like your heart rate and so forth in the people who were doing the practice, we see these changes going on in the autonomic nervous system, which, were really not much of a surprise. Now, again, interestingly, so we have this calming and we have this excitatory side that I call it the arousal side and the quiescent side of the autonomic nervous system. And that they have a very complex interplay between them. So you can have practices like a Buddhist meditation where it's extremely calm, and then you ultimately have this kind of arousal experience that comes on top of it. With a practice like orgasmic meditation, it's probably a very, very opposite kind of experience where you have a more arousing and energizing kind of experience, but then you get the calmness that comes on top of that. So again, it depends on how these experiences and how these practices are structured that enables people to have these different kinds of experiences. But ultimately, it's kind of a combination of this arousal and calming piece to that. So in terms of part of in terms of what we're seeing changes going on in the autonomic nervous system. And then we're seeing changes, at least on the brain scan, in some of these very core areas of the brain that are involved in sexual perception, sexual stimulation. Now, as you mentioned, the other part of your question was that, part of what's happening in this specific practice, since it is a paired practice, there is an interaction that's going on between the two individuals. And to some degree, we see this in other, people talk about, I get asked this all the time, like if you were to have people do Buddhist meditation, is it more powerful if there's 30 people all sitting in a room doing the meditation versus if there's one person doing it? So certainly the social interactions that we have with people, especially when there is an active engagement in that process, becomes a very, can become a very important part of that overall, stimulus that's going on. And so part of what we thought we were seeing in orgasmic meditation are changes that are going on in the social areas of the brain, which is, to me, becomes very critical as you have the person who's providing the stimulation. Part of what's going on is, in some sense, a kind of attention to what that stimulation is. Is it too much? Is it too little? Is it, what's happening? What's happening in the other individual? And so again, you get this kind of back and forth in much the same way. Again, I've seen this in a lot of church ceremonies, for example, where you might have the minister up at the front, and then you have the congregation, and there's almost this kind of back and forth that starts to occur, and you get this kind of resonance that happens that becomes a very critical part of that whole experience and really kind of builds the entire experience. In orgasmic meditation, obviously, it's just the two individuals, but again, you can see how this can be expanded into a lot of different ways of looking at it. But when it comes to the brain itself, again, we're talking about some of the social areas of the brain that can perceive what other people are thinking and feeling, having empathy, having some understanding of what other people are thinking about, for example. And on one hand, there is a deep concentration on the other individual, but there is also, ultimately that can kind of enter into a sense of a flow state where it's almost like a dance. Like at the beginning, you might have to concentrate on what you're doing, but then eventually, if you're just really into the flow of it, it becomes very natural. And in many ways, again, I mean, this is why in Sex, God, and the Brain, there's so much of this issue about just the mating process, which is that you have one person and another person, or one animal, another animal. It's not every pair is meant to be, you know, and
Yeah.
part of, and that's what the rituals are all about, which is finding the other person who can be part of that ritual with you, and gives you that feeling of resonance and connection. And that's part of what these rituals are about, which is to identify that other person, to get the sense of how that interaction is going. And again, you know, there's no one size fits all. Some people like, you know, people who are shy, and some people like people who
Right.
are outgoing, and some people like, you know, like music, and some people like poetry, and so, you know, everybody has to kind of find the pieces that resonate with each person. And in fact, actually, I mean, maybe the last thing, and this is going a little bit of a digression here, but part of the idea about how all of this kind of comes about in the brain, maybe through what's called sexual selection, which is um, how mates are found, basically, and that you have to have kind of a brain that can perceive what the other person is doing and thinking, and they have to have a brain that, you know, does that in reciprocation to whatever it is that you're doing. If you have a great sense of humor but the other person doesn't, then your great sense of humor becomes meaningless.
Right.
But if your great sense of humor is a good, you know, connects with somebody who has a good sense of humor, then, you know, it can really resonate. And even within humor, I mean, again, you know, some people like, you know, very intellectual humor, and some people like
Right.
silly humor, and some people like raunchy humor, and some people like, you know, and so, you know, what somebody finds funny and what somebody else doesn't, again, that's why you do the dance.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. I love the analogy of the dance. I was wondering also, with orgasmic meditation being a paired practice, so there's two people, were there any significant brain changes that you saw because it was specifically two people? And then I would say an added part to that question was there anything surprising that you saw in the brain?
Well, you know, I think one of the things that we thought we had an opportunity to do, which to me, you know, was very exciting to be able to explore, is whether or not uh, there was sort of a connection that was being formed. Could we see some
Mm,
evidence of that connection? And what we meant by that was, you know, were there actual correlations between the brains of the two individuals? So that was one of the things that we actually looked at. And while that level of interaction was a little bit more subtle, it seemed to be there. So it's meaning that when there were certain changes in one person's brain, there were there were reciprocal changes going on in the other person in the pair, and it kind of speaks to this idea of a resonance. So that, you know, there is this kind of back and forth that's going on, and when you have that good connection, then again, the social areas of the brain seem to be associated with that. And what was also particularly interesting was that there were even some correlations between the intensity of the
mm,
experience and some of the changes that were going on in the brain of the other person. You know, so depending on how the brain of the other person was interacting, that had some relationship to the kind of experience that the other person in the pair was having. So all of this to me was very exciting to be able to see that, you know, not only was there this sort of meditative elements to it, but that there seemed to be this kind of cross interaction that we could start to observe by looking at the two, you know, at the pairs themselves, and how they seem to be related to each other.
that's great. Thank you. And then you've made a distinction between general arousal and sexual arousal. And I was wondering if you could talk more about that, and then the ways that orgasmic meditation shares brain changes with familiar practices, or what seems distinct, and where would you say orgasmic meditation fit in terms of general arousal and sexual arousal?
Well, I mean, I think there is overlap between the two types of arousal. You know, again, our one of the things that we talk a lot about in terms of all the spiritual experiences is that there doesn't seem to be a separate part of our brain that turns on. You know, there isn't, when you walk into a church, there isn't a different part of the brain that you know, opens up and starts acting, you know, becoming active, and then it goes away when you leave. And so a lot of the experience of arousal does rely on the autonomic nervous system. It relies on some brain areas as well, including some of the dopamine areas of our brain that are part of the reward system, the limbic system, which is part of the emotional centers of our brain. But a lot of it really has to do with the limbic system and excuse me, with the autonomic nervous system, which is how we either begin to feel this sense of arousal because our heart rate increases and our blood pressure increases, and our pupils dilate and we become ready for action, whatever that action may be. And of course, sexuality and sexual stimulation is an important part of kind of using that autonomic nervous system. In fact, arguably, that's why we have the autonomic nervous system, in part for fight or flight, which is one of the critical pieces that we need to keep ourselves alive. And then also for sexual experiences and sexuality to have mating, so that we not just keep ourselves alive, but we create the next generation. And so in that regard, I think that when we look at what orgasmic meditation, kind of the mechanism by which it works, it seems like it starts with this sense of arousal, which again is not a surprise. There is sexual stimulation is a very strong activator of the autonomic nervous system, particularly the arousal system. So, I mean, that is part of how we are built. And in that regard, it's not just a kind of normal sense of arousal of, oh, I have to pay attention to my teacher who's about to give a lecture, or, this is a really interesting movie I've got to pay attention to. But we're talking about, a felt stimulation in the body, which becomes very, very intense and very strong. And of course, as I talk a lot about in Sex, God, and the Brain, I mean, sexuality is probably arguably one of the most powerful experiences that human beings have. It needs to be, because otherwise our species doesn't continue.
Right.
So, so that in that context, I think, orgasmic meditation has the ability to kind of utilize that arousal in a very intense way. You had mentioned things like whirling dervishes. I mean, that's another way of doing, you just get this incredible frenzied activity. We've studied speaking in tongues, where people are dancing around and doing all kinds of things, so there's overlap there, but I think, ultimately sexual stimulation, again, arguably is going to be one of the more powerful kinds of stimulation that we have, because that's just how we're built. I mean, that's what one of the quotes that I had found when working on Sex, God, and the Brain was just about how, like everything that we do as human beings, our art, our literature, our music, and so forth, the driving energy is that mating sexual drive, because that's what leads to all of our creativity and so forth. So Eddie, we're always trying to impress the other the other person. So that's a big part of it. And your question about where does it fit in with some of the other experiences that we've studied. I mean, I think that part of what is what we see in the brain scan are some of these same kinds of changes with regard to a decrease in the parietal lobe that we talked about, some decreases in the frontal lobe, that feeling of flow and so forth. And so on one hand, I think it helps people to have these kinds of experiences that seem fairly, comparable to other types of practices. Again, every practice has its uniqueness. So it's, and it'd be very difficult to take something which is not specifically religious and say, is it, it's not the same as a religious experience, because it doesn't have a religious component to it. But in terms of some of the basic elements, the sense of unity and oneness, connectedness, surrender, and so forth, there can be a lot of overlap. And I think part of what is always kind of an intriguing piece to all of these practices is, how are they kind of designed to enable people to have these experiences? And does it facilitate those experiences in one way or another? I mean, I think one of the so-called advantages of orgasmic meditation would be that it is a relatively defined practice. It has a very specific timing to it. The timing is relatively brief. And so, that in and of itself might enable people to have very intense experiences relatively quickly, in comparison to somebody who may need to meditate for 2, 3, 4 hours or something like that.
Yeah.
again, you really can't get into better than, worse than.
Right.
It's just that, some people want to have a different kind of experience. And as again, going back to your psychedelic experiences that you were talking about, that's a very controversial aspect as well, because on
Yeah.
one hand, people describe them, as you said, as being incredibly spiritual.
Mhm.
They are described as being the most spiritual experiences that they've ever had. And so for somebody who is a deeply religious or spiritual person, that might, not sit well. On the other hand, as I like to remind people, is that, throughout, the millennia and maybe throughout the eons of humanity, we've always been trying to find ways of stimulating these experiences. So
Mm.
whether we do it through magic mushrooms, ayahuasca, meditation, prayer, sexual stimulation, asceticism, no sensory perception, complete sensory perception. They're all different ways of kind of accessing those kinds of experiences, there's never a one size fits all, but
Yeah.
that, as you look at these different practices, the ones that can utilize common elements of humanity, common elements of who we are as human beings, and common aspects of the experiences are probably going to be those types of practices that are going to be able to help people engage those experiences as effectively as possible.
Yeah, that's great. I like that you gave the example of all of them: sensory deprivation, sensory overload, meditation, orgasmic meditation, whirling dervish, speaking in tongues. Because for me, the inspiration for the podcast really was across domains is mystical experience.
Right.
And for me, I'm really interested in having these conversations from a science perspective, from a practice perspective, and seeing, the intersection is the mystical experience. So it doesn't matter what the vehicle is. We're all going to the same place, which is to access a mystical state.
Mm.
And then I have this secret desire to, I don't know if you saw, I think it was during COVID, there was this cold plunge
Oh,
challenge.
right. Mm-hmm.
People were like dumping buckets of ice
Ice
water on,
water. Yeah.
and then they would call people out. And I have this desire to do like a mystical state challenge and to say, I'm an 18-year orgasmic meditation practitioner. This is my practice. This is why I do it. This is what I believe in terms of accessing a mystical state. What's yours?
Mm-hmm.
So then from a people to people perspective, having a conversation of, okay, well, what is your practice and why do you do it? And what's it like for you to enter into a mystical state? I think those conversations are so interesting and so important.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a little bit of what we talked about in this other book with the varieties of spiritual experience, because through this survey we did get people who had these experiences on all different in all different ways. And one of the things that I talk about neurotheology as a kind of big jigsaw puzzle, and each piece representing those different avenues towards having these experiences. So the study of psychedelics and what they do, the study of near-death experiences, the study of meditation practices, prayer practices, orgasmic meditation. And then there's other aspects, people who have various neurological or psychological disorders. Why is it that schizophrenic patients are more likely to claim that they're the Messiah than to claim
Right.
that they're Steve Jobs or something like that?
Right.
How come they don't envision themselves as being a great business person, but
Right.
they tend to view themselves as messiahs? And then what happens when people have neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's or
Mm.
Parkinson's or something like that? How does that change their sense of spirituality, their sense of religiousness, and so forth? So there's a lot of very interesting questions. So I'm really pleased to hear where you're planning on taking this, because I think it's really helpful to sort of explore what those different avenues are.
Yeah.
But I will also kind of bring up this one very important point that to me is also of critical importance in terms of thinking about these experiences, which is that when people have these experiences, and there are unique elements to those experiences. And what I mean by that is that you might have one person who says, my mystical experience was an incredible feeling of love, and somebody, you know, an incredible feeling of energy, and somebody the connection with God, and somebody connection with universal consciousness. So to me, a big neurotheological, you know, brain as well as just subjective experience question is, are they truly different experiences? Or are they all the same experience, which are then interpreted differently, depending on,
Yes.
you know, where we're coming from?
Yeah.
And I'm not entirely sure, because I could sort of see that if somebody perceives God and someone else perceives Jesus and somebody else perceives Buddha, okay, maybe they're all kind of perceiving a being, and then they just interpret it differently depending on, you know,
Yeah.
where they're coming from. But I don't know if the same is true if somebody says, I felt nothing. You know, I encountered sort of like a Zen, you know, nothingness type of thing, versus someone who says, I felt this incredible rush of love, you know, or awe or something like that. So those could be fundamentally different experiences. You know, I don't know. Obviously there's a huge challenge in knowing exactly, you know, when one of those moments happens, and then how to try to measure that in some way.
Right.
But you know, those are, to me, that's a really interesting question as to, you know, whether or not the differences that people describe are just because they are different people trying to like understand the same thing,
Yeah.
or whether they're really having different kinds of experiences, and don't know yet.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting. It had me think of two things, and actually it's very on par with the final question I want to ask you, which is I often think that ineffable experiences, which is ultimately what a mystical experience is, it's how do I put language to that? Sometimes, you know, for me personally, putting it in language almost feels like I'm, you know, like squeezing myself into a dress that's a little too tight. And at the same time, I want to be able to connect with language to other people about these
Right.
profound experiences. And so when you were saying that, I was wondering sometimes, you know, is it that trying to describe these profound moments of oneness and connection and love, or nothingness or emptiness or heat or whatever it is it because we don't necessarily have the language for it? And then
Right.
I don't know if you know this, they did this study at Johns Hopkins, which I was fascinated by a lot of the stuff that they did, but this one in particular was they took 15 religious leaders across 15 different religions. Over 2 sessions, they gave them moderate to high doses of psilocybin, which is a lot of psilocybin. And one of the things that they found consistently in the study is that it didn't matter what their religious belief was, they all had the same experience in terms of oneness, connection, and affability, and in terms of a mystical state or mystical experience. And for me, it's the thing that we were talking about earlier, which is maybe the vehicle's different, but we're all seeking or going or touching the same place, which is this profound state of emptiness, or the mystical experience. And so it's just it's an interesting conversation to see how it evolves over time. And you know, I personally am interested in speaking to people across all of these different domains.
Right.
Okay, so
Well,
my final question.
well, and
Yes.
let me just say, I mean, you know, the analogy that I often use, and I mean, this is there are many variations on this theme, but you know, like if you talk, if you have, you know, flies buzzing around an elephant, and you could ask the fly, like, what is an elephant? You know, one of them says it's a tusk, and one of them says it's a trunk, and one of them says it's a foot, and one of them says it's a tail, and they're all right. You know, but they're also all wrong. I mean, you know, or at least they're all incomplete, maybe is the better way to say it. And so, you know, when you are talking about kind of the fundamental nature of the universe and the fundamental reality, you know, we may not all be able to experience, you know, it's almost probably impossible to experience the sum total of it, or at least to grab onto it in some way. So we grab onto some piece that we can kind of try to understand. But again, you know, that's why, you know, one person says, then it's God, and somebody else says it's consciousness, and somebody else says it's love, and somebody else says it's particles and waves. And so they may all be right, but they may also all be incomplete.
Yeah. It had me think. I remember even like with orgasmic meditation, we share frames at the end of the experience, and it's this sensory snapshot of a moment during the 15 minutes. I felt something in my body, and I share it, and my partner shares it. And over time, my language for sensation developed. So in the beginning, I knew how to track heat. Heat was the strongest sensory experience I knew. And so I could track it. Oh, I can feel it in my face. I can feel it in my stomach. I can feel it in my genitals. And I knew how to say that. And so now over time, though, I can say, 2/3 of the way through the Om, on the final moments of the peak, when you moved your finger a millimeter to the left, I felt this like thick pooling and opening in my stomach. But it took me time to be able to put language to this deep experience that I was having, because someone would say, do you have a frame? And I would look at them like they were speaking a foreign language.
Right.
But I had this whole profound experience. And so I think it also takes practice in terms of putting language to it.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, this is why there are theologians and sacred texts and sacred texts that analyze sacred texts. And, and it's about trying to understand something that is extremely challenging to understand. As saying it, it's ineffable. And the joke I always sort of say is, I always love when everybody says, oh, I had this experience. It was ineffable. It was completely indescribable, but let me tell you about it. And you're like, well, wait. But it is, I mean, it's part of humanity. I mean, we try to understand things. I mean, that is the nature of our brain as well. And so we're trying to make some sense of it. And again, we bring to that experience everything that came before us. And so if we come at whatever experience, whether it's orgasmic meditation or a psychedelic or whatever, from a Catholic perspective, then we're going to look at it differently than if we're coming at it from a Buddhist or, Hindu or Jewish or atheist or whatever perspective. So there are different ways in which we sort of think about what these experiences are and how we can understand them. And that to me is in many ways kind of lying at the heart of neurotheology, which is, how does our brain, it's not just trying to understand the experiences, but how does our brain help us to try to understand those experiences? So there's this kind of, endless regression of trying to learn and try to understand. And that, which to me is what it's all about. It's just, how do we, what are the paths to getting towards knowledge and understanding?
Yeah. Okay. So my final question
Yes.
is, can you see or track enlightenment in the brain?
Well, I would say that we can track certain elements of it. And in some sense we have done that when we were talking earlier about the feeling of unity and clarity and so forth. These are elements that we can look at, and then when we do brain scans of people who have these different experiences and so forth, we can allude to those kinds of changes. The reason that your question is challenging is that the ultimate aspect of the experience is a subjective experience. And there's no way for me to tap someone on the shoulder and say, are you at enlightenment yet? No. Okay, I'll come back in a few minutes. How about now? And of course, if you were in the moment of enlightenment and I tapped you on the shoulder, it would probably disrupt that experience. So it is, from a scientific perspective, it's very challenging to really ever capture one of those experiences in a direct way. So I think we can make, but I think we can make inferences. We can study elements of those experiences. We can study practices that lead to those experiences. And one last answer to your question is that there's an intriguing piece to what enlightenment is, which is that because there's two kinds of enlightenment, so to speak. There's the moment of enlightenment, the moment that the shift occurs, but then there is being an enlightened being.
Yes.
And so arguably that in some ways would be easier to study because I could take 15 or 20 people who are enlightened and
Right.
compare them to 20 people who are not enlightened, that would be a relatively easier thing to do. But that's fraught with its own problems too, which is to say, well, who's to decide whether or not they are enlightened or not?
Right.
Who made that decision? And was it them? Was it a man?
Right.
Their Zen master? Was it their mother? I mean, who was it who decided that they were in fact enlightened? And how does one, make that determination? So, and that even gets to a whole other level of the neurotheology world and the field of scholarship of neurotheology, which are definitions. And in some sense, we've been kind of dancing around these terms. You've been using terms like mystical or enlightenment or something like that. What exactly does that mean?
Right.
And if I were to ask, if I were to convene a group of neuroscientists and a group of theologians and a group of Buddhist monks and a group of Christian mystics and a group of Sufi, I mean, and a group of anthropologists, and they would all come up with different definitions of what they
Right.
mean by mystical, spiritual, religious, and so forth. So there are a lot of wonderful challenges. I mean, that to me is what makes this whole field very exciting, and hopefully gives me another 30 years of things to look at and do. There's just a lot for us to sort of unpack and to see how all of these different things fit together. And that's what the future holds. I guess there are hopefully more studies, and we'll get better techniques and better
Yeah.
approaches, and some of those better techniques will be neuroimaging. Some of them will be the ways in which we ask questions. Maybe there are some ways in which we do our own internal contemplative processes that can yield knowledge and information in systematic ways. So stay tuned. There's a lot for us to. There's a long way to go.
I can't wait. I also cannot wait for the book, which comes out August 6th. You can purchase it on Amazon. It is called Sex, God, and the Brain. This has been so wonderful. Thank you for joining me on the Send Off podcast for Journey into the Mystic. I am Rachel Pelletier, and thank you again to Dr. Andrew Newberg.
Thank you.
Yeah.